It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Victoria Donnaloja back to our Social Policy Department to give a talk today. Victoria is currently a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow in the Sociology Department of University of Essex. For those of you who don't know, she's a proud PhD graduate from our department, receiving her PhD in 2021, and then spent a year at the European University Institute as a Max Weber Fellow before joining Essex. Victoria has studied the changing function of citizenship in response to migration. Her work has appeared in Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, Social Science Research, and European Sociological Review. Her current project is funded by Leverhulme, and it seeks to understand why attitudes towards immigrants change across generations. So today we will hear about some of the newest results from this project. So without further ado, I'll give the stage to Victoria.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's nice to be back. So yeah, today I'm presenting sort of the first part of this larger project on education and attitudes towards immigrants. So the starting point for the project is this very consistent finding in this literature where people with higher levels of education are consistently more positive about immigration and have more positive attitudes towards immigrants. This has been replicated in consistently in Western countries. You would think that because there's such a strong relationship at the individual level, that as education expands, so as younger generations become more highly educated, you would end up with a society that is more inclusive of immigrants. So you would essentially, it would be a fair assumption to think that this, the fact that people become more educated on average means that societies on average also become more inclusive. However, there's mixed evidence on this. So younger generations are not necessarily more positive about immigration than older generations. There's at least a couple of studies that show that younger generations can be more hostile to immigrants. And so this raises a puzzle. Why does this very strong individual level relationship does not manifest itself in the aggregate, right? There are many ways to address this puzzle. The way I'm going to present two papers today, and the way I address this here is by looking at this relationship between education and attitudes over different generations. So the first paper is about generations over time, different in the 20th century, and the other one is looking at the family. So why should we care? Countries care a lot about the level of education of their population, to the extent that the European Union, for example, has a target where they want 45% of people aged between 25 and 35 to be highly educated. Obviously, the reason is not because they want them to be more positive about immigration, but this could be another, like a byproduct, right? A positive byproduct of that. So essentially, I would argue that it's important, given that there's so much focus on this finding that education matters for attitudes, to really understand what we can expect from education and whether it's a driver of social inclusion for society. So this is just to show you, for the UK, the expansion of education for people born between 1925 and 1995 is from the Barnley data. So you can see that the percentage of people with a degree has increased steadily for cohorts over the 20th century. So why should education inform these attitudes, explain these attitudes? So there are two main theories around this, the absolute and positional theory. So according to the absolute model, university, and I say university because that's where we see the biggest break in attitude between people who have a degree and people who don't have a degree. According to this model, going to university teaches you things that are important to be positive of immigration. So values of tolerance, values of equality. It should teach you certain analytical skills and critical skills so that you might be more critical of the information that you receive. and better understand issues such as immigration. Socialization might be another mechanism. So obviously teacher socialization, but also peer socialization. In the UK, universities are also more diverse than the rest of society, so that contact with diversity might also be a channel through which attitudes are formed positively. There have been some studies looking at this with, that have basically used these reforms to the compulsory schooling system in Europe to try to identify the effect of a little bit more schooling on attitudes towards immigrants. So these are reforms about high school, for example, in Germany and Norway, and they found mostly effects, but very small effects. So this is obviously very valuable work, but these are very local effects. So these are findings for specific cohorts, specific points of time who experience these reforms. Also, these effects are quite small, so they don't really explain this big gap that we see between university and non-university graduates and graduates. An alternative model says that essentially education only matters as a proxy. It's a proxy of socioeconomic positioning. If you're highly educated, you have a higher socioeconomic status, and that's why you don't feel threatened by migration. Essentially, you don't have to compete with immigrants in the labor market. You don't have to compete with them, over jobs, but also over resources, public resources, welfare, and public services, and so on. So in this view, education not only matters as a signifier of socioeconomic positioning. There's some evidence in favor of this too. Of course, it's possible they're neither correct. Maybe education doesn't actually shape attitudes, but it's all due to selection. So people with more positive attitudes towards immigrants are more likely to go to university. And there's some work for Switzerland and some more recent one for Germany that shows that as people go through the educational system, their attitudes don't really change. And so that would suggest that maybe everything is happening before people even go to university, right? Another possibility is that these effects are quite superficial. We will know about social desirability bias. You can expect that these differences are superficial, that this is what we find in surveys, but actually attitudes are not that different in like the views that people hold more privately. There's some evidence to support this, even though there is social desirability bias, though, this is not enough to explain, again, this big gap that we see. So it exists, but it's not enough to explain it. I will go back to these points at the end, because I want to address them directly in the analysis, but I'll discuss them again. So in the first paper, I want to test this absolute versus positional hypothesis. So I do this by looking at whether this relationship between education and attitudes is consistent over the expansion of education. I do this looking at cohorts over the 20th century, so between those born in the 1920s, more or less, and 1990s. I use different measures of attitudes towards immigrants, so I don't focus on just one dimension, which is often what we find in surveys, just because of data limitations. And I focus on this difference between graduates and non-graduates, so really looking at university participation. So the first way to test these two theories, so whether the effect of education is absolute or positional, is to see if there's a consistent gap between graduates and non-graduates over the expansion of education. So you would think that if education shapes my views, it doesn't really matter if people around me are highly educated or not. This is a direct effect. I've experienced education, my views have changed. If instead it's simply positioning me on top of everyone else, as more people become highly educated, this power to insulate me from competition should diminish. And so you would expect the gap to become smaller as education expands between high and low educated. So that's the first thing I do. I test these two competing hypotheses to see if this gap stays the same across levels of education, societal education. An assumption in this literature about socioeconomic positioning is always that immigrants are low skilled. But that's not necessarily true, especially in the UK. They've been increasingly, the more recent migration policies from the 2000s are very selective. And so they select migrants on skill and earning potential. So more recent cohorts of migrants are actually more highly educated than the British born. And so that's true for Europeans and non-Europeans on average. And so it's possible that younger cohorts in the UK experience more competition, are more vulnerable to competition of immigrants. And so it's possible, another way to test this hypothesis is to see if the difference between high and low educated has gotten smaller for these cohorts who enter the labor market in the 2000s, because they will be more vulnerable to competition, and essentially their socioeconomic positioning is a bit weaker. So that's the second way I look into this positional logic. Finally, so until now, I've only talked about what would happen to the high educated if, in terms of their loss of position of socioeconomic status, right? But it's possible that as education expands, everyone suffers from it. So people who are highly educated access jobs for which they're overqualified, right? So there's more competition for them, so they have to go sort of down the occupational ladder a bit. So they're pushing the people who would have had those jobs at the time, they're pushing them further down. And so the gap between them might stay the same. Everyone's sort of pushed further down. But this doesn't mean that there isn't a negative effect of education expansion, because everyone's sort of suffering, but the gap stays the same. So the final way I look into this is to see if there's this direct negative effect of education expansion on attitudes for everyone. So in the analysis, one thing you might be thinking about already is the fact that I'm looking at cohorts, I'm looking at this over time, and so a problem in this type of analysis is age period cohort, the identification problem. So essentially the fact that you can't really estimate all three, because mathematically once you know two, you can predict the third one. So the way I approach this is there's different ways, but essentially I care a lot about cohort effects. I care a lot about differences between cohorts, and I expect different cohorts to have different attitudes. We also know that there's period effects, so different, you can imagine things happening like a Trump election, things like that, affect attitudes towards immigrants. So I want to be able to identify that. And so I impose the constraint on age, which means I'm not really estimating any age effect here. I'm simply dichotomizing age, where I divide it between people under the age of 65 and people over the age of 65. The idea being that maybe as you retire, get old, maybe you become a bit more rigid in your thinking. So age is not doing a lot in this model. So the way, the first two hypotheses, competing hypotheses, to test that, I use an ordered logistic regression. I'll talk about the outcomes in a second on attitudes towards immigrants, where I interact individual educational attainment with the expansion of education, which are called the educational environment, to see if there's this strong relationship between education and attitudes is consistent across levels of expansion. I then look at the interaction between education and cohort to see if younger cohorts who are highly educated are more similar than older cohorts. The idea being that they would be more, suffering more from competition. And then finally, I drop the interaction and I see if there's simply like a direct negative effect of educational, the expansion of education, net of this positive individual relationship. So I used two surveys, the British Elections Study and the British Social Attitudes Survey, that have started, one in the 60s, one in the 80s, and they're ongoing. They're both cross-sectional surveys, so they don't follow people over time. They're repeated cross-sections. I select the sample to include people over the age of 25, so that to give them the chance to have finished their educational trajectories. I also use the Barron-Lee educational attainment dataset, and that's to calculate the societal level of education. So my dependent variables. So these surveys are amazing. They include a lot of questions on attitudes towards immigrants, but the nature of these surveys is for them to be very current. And so the questions have changed a lot over time. So this is to say I have many measures of attitudes, and I couldn't reduce them to one index. I will argue that this is actually a good thing. Hopefully I'll convince you, but in general, I have many outcomes. I divided them into 3 topics: attitudes around levels of immigration, attitudes around immigration from specific origins, and then attitudes on the impact immigration has on society. So, for example, crime, the economy, and so on. And obviously, I'm using 2 surveys as well. So, each question though was asked for at least 10 years in the survey. They're all measured on a classic Likert scale, from totally agree to totally disagree. Yeah. So my independent variables of interest are obviously individual educational attainment, so whether someone has a degree or not. This educational environment captures the expansion of education. So this is the percentage of people with a degree within 10-year cohorts at age 25, year of birth, and then a control for sort of the usual suspects: ethnicity, occupational class, home ownership, region of residence. So yes, so bear with me. I'll show you a lot of graphs, but hopefully I'll guide you through them because they're all quite similar. So this is due to the many applicants. So what I'm showing you here is the marginal effect of having a degree versus not having a degree on holding a negative attitude over, over the expansion of education on the x-axis. So what I'm aiming to show you here is whether this gap between high and low educated in their attitudes is consistent, or whether it approaches 0. So if you look at the first question, for example, whether the probability of agreeing that we should reduce immigration is lower for graduates versus non-graduates, so it's below 0. And that's consistent as more people in the cohort of the individual who's answering this question, as more people become more highly educated. And so this is evidence to suggest that this relationship is consistent. It's absolute. It's not really positional. It doesn't really change. The size of these and the range of these lines is different. The first, because obviously depending on how many years the question was asked for, different levels of cohorts were covered, and also sample sizes obviously vary a lot because of that. So at the tails are a bit larger because you have smaller sample sizes for these super old cohorts, like those born in the 1920s and those born in the 1999. So now I'm showing the same thing, but for the questions on the impact immigration has on society. So crime, jobs, the economy, culture, and so on. Same thing. It's a pretty consistent negative effect. So highly educated people are less likely to hold a negative view, and this doesn't really change. So until now, this is more evidence in favor of the absolute model. So then moving on to the hypothesis that maybe younger cohorts are more vulnerable to this socioeconomic positioning and the expansion of education. So here I'm showing you the predicted probability of holding a negative view for questions on immigration levels The blue line are people with a degree. The dashed line are people without a degree. So the blues are always below the dash. So that means they're more positive consistently across cohorts. The gap is pretty constant. So they're always more positive. As for younger cohorts, as we go along the x-axis, they tend to be more positive overall, like both groups. So you have this downward slope. So younger groups are tend to be younger generations on these questions tend to be more positive, independently of their level of education. But if we then look at these questions and the impact immigration has on society, the picture is a bit different. So the first thing to look at is the gap. So does the gap change? And the gap doesn't really change. So highly educated people are consistently more positive or less likely to be negative. That gap is consistent across generations. The thing to notice, though, are the trends. Whereas in the previous slide, I show you graphs with mainly downward sloping trends. Here you can see that younger generations are not necessarily more positive about immigration. So you have either this like concave or convex shapes, which basically show that younger generations are more similar to the older generations. And sometimes these trends are going up. So for example, if you look at the question here on whether immigrants take jobs from the British born, younger generations are actually more likely to agree with that statement. So yes, there's a gap, but in terms of trends, they kind of move in parallel, right? Like they're kind of moving together. So now for the last hypothesis, I'm showing you, and I'll whiz through these a bit quickly because they're all the same. I want to see if, okay, we know that people with a degree are less likely to be negative about immigration, but we want to know if there's a direct effect of this educational environment. And that's not the case, essentially. And I'll go through these quickly because there's no direct effect of this expansion of education on attitudes. So again, no evidence in favor of this positional hypothesis. So this is the same for all these outcomes. So from this first part, what does this all mean? Overall, it's more evidence in favor of this absolute theory rather than positional. There's not much evidence that the expansion of education has really impacted the association between education and attitudes. However, if we zoom out, and if we don't just zoom in and look at the gap between high and low educated, if we zoom out a bit and we look at these trends and like how these groups move together, we can see that actually younger generations, for the questions on the impact immigration has on society, are actually more negative than older generations. And so, what are these cohort trends, due to? There's obviously many options. One is demographic change, obviously. The demographic composition of the country has changed a lot, and immigration has changed a lot too. The political salience of immigration. I think one interesting thing about these surveys, if you look at how these questions have changed over time, these questions about the impact immigration has on society were introduced in the early 2000s. Before that, there were no questions on jobs and crime and so on. They were more about race, essentially. So that in itself, kind of, because of the nature of these surveys that are meant to be very current and related to political events, is a bit of an indication of how the conversation about immigration has changed. And so maybe these younger generations are reacting to these cohort-wide mechanisms. So I haven't addressed selection and social desirability bias. Selection, I can't really test for either of these. Selection, I would argue that as education expands, graduates by definition become less selected. So if that were the case, we should still see a weakening of this relationship if selection were the only factor. And then with social desirability bias, I think this is not, I'm not able to show what education is doing. That's further work. But even if education is only acting on a superficial level. It's still doing something. It might not be exactly what we wanted to do, but it's still doing something, right? And that's sort of the question here. So in the second paper, I look at this question about generations, and this is work with Magda Berkowska, who's also at Essex. So here we look at whether, so essentially, until now we've been thinking, and this theory has been thinking about individual level education and attitude, and kind of thinking of generations as separate. But obviously we know that generations are very connected, or like interlinked in the family. And so we ask whether parental education influences the attitudes of children, and look into why that might be. So we focus on the family. In doing this, we kind of expand these theories of absolute and positional socioeconomic status positioning to apply it to parents. And we see if there's like long-lasting effects of educational inequality. So we know that parents matter for the formation of political attitudes, because political attitudes form quite early on. There's the sort of famous early years theory by which people form their attitudes in adolescence, and then growing up to the age around 25, 30. Obviously, it's not like a perfect number, but essentially after that, as they get older, their attitudes don't really change. And so this means that the formative years, like the adolescence, is very important for the formation of these attitudes. And obviously parents are then going to be very, going to influence their kids. Highly educated parents are especially likely to transmit their political attitudes, because they tend to be more political and more invested perhaps in their children's political views. So the first simple hypothesis is that we expect the net of individual educational attainment, parental educational attainment also explains some of the variation in attitudes. So essentially, people whose parents are more highly educated are then more likely to have more positive attitudes themselves. So then thinking about the why, if we apply the two theories of absolute and positional, so we can think of how they can apply to parents, essentially. So one main mechanism of the absolute theory is socialization. And so, of course, you can imagine parents who hold certain attitudes, whatever attitude they hold really, to teach those attitudes to their kids, teach them the values that underpin those attitudes, maybe have behavior that is consistent with those attitudes, and so they would influence their kids directly in this way. An alternative and maybe additional way of influencing their kids might be by positioning them in a better socioeconomic position, right? So more highly educated parents who are better off have kids who grow up with more privilege, and that might mean they have different experiences of immigration, for example. One thing might be travel, one thing might be in public service, in accessing public services. They will also have a different experience of their parents' perception of competition of immigration, experience or perception. And so you can expect kids who grow up more privileged to then be more positive about immigration as adults. And the third channel might be education itself. So parents who are highly educated are more likely to have kids who go on to be highly educated, and that's pretty well established. And so part of this individual relationship that we find between education and attitude might actually be rooted in the parent. So might actually be sort of privilege as well, because parents are more educated, they send their kids to university, and that might be explain why they're why they're more positive about immigration. So essentially we test these three hypotheses. We look at the mediation between parental education and attitudes through socialization, socioeconomic positioning, and higher education. So the analysis evolves around two steps. First, an order logistic regression, where we want to see if parental education explains some of the variation in attitudes. And then we decompose this effect into a direct effect and these indirect effects. We want to see these three channels if they explain why parental education matters. We use this KHP method. I'm happy to talk more about it, but essentially it's just a decomposition method that is applied to order logistic regression. So the data we use are from Understanding Society, which is a panel survey for the UK. There are 12 waves. So attitudes towards immigrants are asked in wave 12 only. So we get people in wave 12, we link them to their parents who have also answered these questions, attitudes towards immigrants in wave 12. And then we go back to the previous waves to collect information about the parents. So essentially we want to know how the kid grew up. So when the kid was around the age of 14, we want to know the situation of their parents, their socioeconomic positioning, and so on. So this is why we capped the sample to be of people under the age of 30, so that we have them in the previous waves when they were 14, right? If they were older than that, we couldn't see them when they were 14. We have a sample of around 3,200 people. Obviously, many of them are siblings, and so we cluster standard errors because we expect them not to share just the parents, but other things as well. So we want to account for that. We use the weights provided by Understanding Society. There are two outcomes for two measures of attitudes towards immigrants. One around immigrants, whether immigrants are good for Britain's economy, and one whether they harm Britain's culture. Again, asked on a strongly disagree to strongly agree scale. So the independent variables. So again, parental higher education is the main predictor we're interested in, so whether parents have a degree or not. At the individual level, we distinguish between young adults who either don't have a degree and aren't in higher education, and those who have a degree, but also those who aren't currently in higher education. This is because we're interested in these things that happened before, right? So we want to include people who are currently in higher education together with those who are actually graduates. For parental socioeconomic positioning, we include occupational class, housing tenure, equivalent household income, and then for socialization, we include parental attitudes. These are measured at wave 12, unfortunately, because they weren't asked when the kid was actually 14. We control for different things at the individual and parental level. Some things we only control for parents because they're very similar between parents and child. For example, ethnicity, it's not necessarily the same, but it's a very high correlation. We also include these two LSOA variables. So these are neighborhood level indices. One is a deprivation index and one is a diversity index. The idea being that maybe there are other environmental influences on attitudes beyond the parent. And we want to separate the two.
Which administrative level? Sorry.
LSOA, that's around 3,000 people.
Okay.
So findings. So what I'm showing you here is the predicted probability of having a positive view. So at the top of the graph, so those with the lowest probability of holding a positive view on immigration are those who don't have a degree and whose parents don't have a degree. Whereas those with the highest probability are those who have a degree themselves and their parents have a degree. So there's this additive effect. Even, net of your own education, having parents who are highly educated actually matters. In the middle, you have, with a very similar probability, you have those who don't have a degree but their parents have a degree, and those who have a degree but their parents don't have a degree. So what this suggests is that parental education actually matters quite a bit, to the extent that it compensates for individuals not being highly educated themselves. So this essentially for both outcomes shows that parental education is doing a lot of the work. I mean, these are all statistically significant. The only two groups that are similar are these two I just mentioned. So what I'm showing you here now are these KHB, the KHB outputs. So we know parental education matters for attitudes. We want to know what are the channels through which this matters. And what this graph shows is the percentage each one of these mediators contributes to the total effect of parental education. And I'm only showing you the statistically significant ones. So the first thing to notice is parental attitudes. So around 40% of the effect of parental education on attitudes of their children goes through parental attitudes. So essentially, parents are highly educated, they're more likely to have more positive attitude, and then that's why their kids are more positive about immigration. So this socialization mechanism. The second, way less important but still contributing factor is education itself. So where it says highly educated. So, and that's like a 15% contribution to the total effect. So that means people whose parents are highly educated are more likely to go to university, and that's why they have more positive attitudes, partially. Finally, okay, so for socioeconomic status, I've included the two things that are statistically significant. It's a small contribution that might look weird, so I'll have to explain it. So essentially what's happening here, so let's take the renting finding, for example. So parents who are highly educated are less likely to rent. People who rent are less likely to have positive attitudes, right? Or have less positive attitudes. Because the mediation is a multiplication of the two, this turns into a positive finding. But so the interpretation of this is essentially that this is reinforcing the relationship between parental education and attitudes. So part of the reason why people have more positive attitudes if their parents are highly educated is that those parents are less likely to rent. Similarly, parents who are more highly educated are less likely to be inactive. Inactive means many things, but in this sample, it mainly means stay-at-home moms. And so they're less likely to be inactive, and that partially explains why their kids end up having more. So what does this mean? Well, parental education matters a lot. Again, there's like weak evidence in favor of the positional argument. The last two things I showed you, like that they make a small contribution. Socialization seems to be the biggest mechanism. We have very similar attitudes to our parents. I suppose if you think of individual education as, a privileged mechanism, so, this transmission of education, like the likelihood of going to university, that could also be seen as sort of socioeconomic positioning, but that's different from economic resources per se. So overall, with these two papers, I think what we show is that there's this relationship between education and attitudes is very robust. It's very consistent. It's consistent across generations, across cohorts. It's so strong to the extent that parental education also matters for their adult children, and it's long lasting. There's little evidence that this is due to economic resources. This does not mean that there's necessarily a completely direct effect, but it's a pretty strong relationship. Obviously, there might be other things we're missing in measuring socioeconomic positioning. However, I think it's also important to be mindful of these trends. So when we look at, in this work, we often focus on the differences between high and low educated. But that's not enough. We need these trends to actually see that cohorts might move in the same way, and their younger people might still be more negative about immigration, even net of these differences. And yes, I think there's more work now looking at attitudes towards immigrants and the fact that it's not necessarily good to reduce them to one index, and these different aspects about immigration, people respond to them quite differently. And so, yeah, it's good to analyze these separately. Next steps, I will look into what these attitudes for the highly educated look like more